You're very welcome. This is the second section of my, I guess, presentation about the human brain. The first section was about the anatomy of the brain, and this is about the brain as it ages. If you have any questions at the end of the presentation, you can bring them to the live sessions or send them to me by email, but I hope that this will be pretty clear. I'm just going to share the screen now. So you will have seen this last slide at the end of the presentation about the anatomy of the brain, a little teaser about what's to come. And as I say here, it is not this linear. The brain isn't simply small and getting larger, but there are changes in the brain over different phases of the lifespan. And there are more changes in different phases of the lifespan for people who were born with ovaries and have the female sex hormones of estrogen and progesterone. And those changes primarily happen during pregnancy and peri and post menopause. So we shall dive in. So I think this is surprising, but by the time we're 6, our brain is pretty large and it doesn't get much bigger. Um, it is a really important time neurologically. There is, as I'm sure you can probably even remember, or if you have kids or nieces or nephews, or maybe you teach younger people, there is a huge amount of neurological development going on, and you can see it in things as basic and really in a way most visible in the basic things like handwriting, bicycling, things that we can see almost the neuroplasticity where initially there is such awkwardness and then this almost visible churning of the cogs of the wheels, the cogs of the brain rather, the wheels of the and cogs of the brain that brings that brain on board with what the individual is trying to achieve. And then, of course, as we know, things like writing and riding a bicycle become second nature at around the age in infancy. So I don't know exactly the specific age, but there is a phenomenon known as neural pruning at a younger stage than this image here. And neural pruning is where a good large number of synapses and neurons are pruned away, are discarded, or I guess reabsorbed, and are no longer because they're no longer needed as the individual develops. There is some suggestion that neural pruning may be more limited in people with autism, so that the possibility exists that there is a higher number of neurons firing in the brain in people with autism, which, speaking from the experience of my daughter, for example, who is autistic, is that it would explain for me, this is a personal observation rather than anything that I've come across definitive research on, but explains this idea of that sense of overwhelm, where if there is a lot of neurological activity, then there is a potential of too much sensory input or too much neurological input, and would help to um, explain the need for space, the need for simplicity, the need for less noise, the need for fewer people, the need for less eye contact, that basically there is such a huge amount of information being processed. You will have learned from Diana that there are millions of pieces of information being um, entering into our brains at any given moment, but that we only process a small portion of them. And so if you imagine trying to process and hold a huge number of extra, I guess, neurological stimuli, you can imagine how overwhelming that would be. And while on the subject of autism, there is also some suggestion that there is a higher level of glutamate, which is a stimulating neurotransmitter that we talked about. Yes, we talked about yesterday or in the lecture about brain anatomy and neurological anatomy. But it's not the brain that you will continue to have. So the average 6-year-old brain, 90% of the size that it will be as an adult, just doesn't just continue to get bigger until it's at 100%. There is a hell of a lot else going on. There is some shrinkage that happens in all genders in puberty and during pregnancy and peri and post menopause. We also see shrinkage, which points to, of course, the huge hormonal effects of hormones on the brain and the importance of those effects on the brain, of hormones on the brain. Just to note, those images of brains are not trying to indicate anything special to you by their different lights and all of that and colors. That's just some nice little images that I thought would be pleasant to pop into the slide. So adolescence, I think we may not consider this, lasts up until our early 20s and includes puberty. And this is a time where more of the sort of permanent remodeling gets done. So there is shrinkage and there is more neural pruning in that use of or unused gray matters being discarded and connections let go of. There may be a pruning that happens around things that we've learned to do and that no longer need cognitive input, like cycling a bike or writing, for example. So we no longer need to maintain that cognitive volume to perform those tasks. They are innate in the nervous system and the physical body. So we're trying to make room for more things that are going to be learnt. White matter, there you see the third thing in the list, is the part of the brain that connects all the information that's going into the brain and makes sense of it and connects it to your body, connects one side of the brain to the other, connects the brain, the cognitive brain, to the limbic system, to the more emotional systems. And this is a time when the individual is going to develop a different brain to the other individual. So that, for example, one of my daughters is very much interested in drawing, and she will be developing now the part of her brain that enables her to draw more accurately. Whereas her sister, my other daughter, is more into kind of scientific-y type stuff, and she's also very peer orientated, a lot of socialization. But clearly her brain and her personality is interested in something different. So from this point on, they are specializing and their brains will be more different by the time they're 23 than they will have been at the age of 11. And that thing of joining up our parts of our brain to each other, joining up the emotional centers to the cognitive centers. This is a lot that's going on in adolescence and puberty. But the trouble is that we have slow development of the cognitive parts of the brain, and the reflexive, more animal part of the brain, the limbic system and the amygdala, is comparatively larger than it will be when we reach adulthood. So just taking a moment to think about that, that means that that reactive, knee-jerk, more animal, older part of the brain that just responds very quickly without analysis is more dominating the brain than the cognitive brain, or than it will be in the future. So this knowledge helps me to understand my teenagers a bit more. And if you think about it, they really simply often don't have a choice about their cognitive ability to steer their emotions. The need for adolescents to prioritize peer connection over, for example, family connection or over study is highly developmental when we consider, if you will, for a moment, that the purpose of, or the main drive of all species is the procreation of the species, the proliferation of the species. So having connection to your peers is part of the ability to select a mate with whom to procreate. And this is not about sexual choice, gender choice, choice to have babies or not. It is about a species urge. So that peer belonging is so important at that stage that they have seen that rejection of a peer or of a partner, a boyfriend, girlfriend, lover, is as painful or is as triggering and difficult as physical pain signals. So that the trauma, the drama that we might, as we might call it, of how a teenager and adolescent feels when rejected is much stronger, much more understandable than we might give it space for. The other thing is that the adolescent brain is looking constantly for new things. So what will bring me out of the nest? So the job of every human is to find their way away from the parent or parents. And how do we do that? It's by identifying what makes us passionate or interested enough, and also maybe safe enough, or anything, held enough, loved enough to bring me out of the family fold and into the world. So that's a time when novelty might involve experimenting with substances, or it might involve joining clubs, or it might involve, you know, going skydiving, going traveling. Those kinds of things are very much um, a purpose of the development of the adolescent brain for the preparation of the job of making more humans, which, yeah, without any value on that, that is the drive, the species drive. I think it's interesting, just the small type at the bottom there, that our gray matter, which is the ends of the neurological connection, is fully developed by our mid-20s, but the white matter, which is kind of the bit that's a bit more refined and is making all those connections, is not developed until our late 20s, possibly even early 30s or 30. So pregnancy is a bit of a thing. Any of you here who have been pregnant may recognize that there are emotional and memory related changes that are experienced during pregnancy. But just a little step back from the adolescent to the adult. So without pregnancy, there is a little blip in between, or maybe the entire adult life, which is that our full maturation depends on the onset of puberty. So if your puberty, or your child's or family member's puberty, is late, they may seem to have less cognitive and emotional abilities to self-regulate, for example, because the hormones that kick in or become abundant in puberty, both in cis males and cis females, are a trigger for brain maturation. So in pregnancy, again, they don't completely know why the brain shrinks, but the likelihood is that we see a neural pruning. So the brain is preparing itself for, again, what the species feels is the most important thing, which is growing the fetus to full maturity, birthing a baby, and managing to keep that baby alive and nurturing that baby into adulthood. And so you can see that in a simpler world, one of a hunter-gatherer perhaps, there are certain things that don't aren't needed anymore in order to do that particular job. So neural pruning and shrinkage of the brain occurs during pregnancy. But interestingly here, white matter, the part of the brain that is really supporting joined up thinking or connecting parts of the brain to each other, the emotional brain to the cognitive brain, that seems to be more integrous. Um, yes, important to remember when you are speaking, if you are speaking to someone who is struggling with pregnancy brain, is that it does usually resolve, usually 6 months, but reports of up to 24 months. Sorry, beg your pardon. Reports of up to 24 months have been seen. Just a note on the actual symptoms of pregnancy brain that many women experience, and certainly these are not uncommon as we grow older. They're not uncommon in peri and post menopause. I've written where I've got written lower concentration there, I have in brackets on question mark. So lower ability to concentrate on what? There is probably a higher ability to concentrate on certain things, and lower concentration tests might be on cognitive tasks that are actually not relevant to people during pregnancy. So usually these shrinkages, these adaptations in the brain have a purpose. They're not a mistake and they're not a mess. So thinking of them in, I guess, a more compassionate way via an awareness of the logic of why this might be happening, I think is the yogic path, because otherwise we are catastrophizing the difficulties and we are not sitting with the truth, which is this is just simply what happens in our species. So this is the main reason I started to converse with Diana about running this training, was that I learned as I was running my yoga for menopause trainings about how much is going on in the female brain at peri and post menopause. And of course, that will happen also in the transition of a cis female to cis, or to, sorry, not to cis male, of course, a cis female to transitioning gender, losing or having female sex hormones blocked. So anyone who experiences menopause, whether from the average age of mid 40s or premature menopause or surgical menopause or medical menopause or gender treatment menopause, will experience brain-related symptoms. And there has been, or there is continuing to be, some amazing research, particularly by someone I recommend you look up, Lisa Mosconi, who is at the forefront of research into what happens in the brain during perimenopause through MRIs as well as talking to women. So it is she's one of the most, I would say she probably is the most advanced expert, a neurologist expert in menopause. And she calls it a transition, not just of the ovaries, but of the brain. So some of the symptoms, and there are more, the main symptoms would be temperature regulation. And that may be because, well, we know the temperature regulation happens in the hypothalamus to a great degree. And before menopause and in other genders, the hypothalamus considers a certain range of core temperature safe. And just as a very incorrect but easy to visualize example, let's imagine that the hypothalamus thinks that when your core temperature is between 20 degrees and 30 degrees, it's safe and nothing needs to change. Then when we reach perimenopause, what is believed is causing hot flashes and hot flushes and night sweats is that the hypothalamus is confused about what is a safe range. So instead of 20 to 30 degrees, it thinks 24 to 28 degrees is a safe range. So suddenly it starts to make corrections if it believes you are overheating or indeed even moving towards hypothermia, because there is also a phenomenon known as cold flushes or people experiencing extreme cold in menopause. But primarily, what is experienced is hot flushes when the hypothalamus thinks that your core is dangerously hot, and so it pushes heat out into the hands, the cheeks, anywhere far away from the organs to keep them safe. And that is experienced in simply heat in the body or sweating for some people also. It can also trigger a stress response where the stress hormones can increase as well, especially if we're asleep. It will tend to wake us up, often with anxiety, because the stress hormones are there to wake us up in order to throw the duvet off so that we don't overheat. Memory struggles would be obviously connected to a considerable number of parts of the brain, but the hippocampus as one of them. Emotional intensities might be associated with the amygdala being a little more on fire. The limbic system in general, that more knee-jerk, reactive, more ancient part of the brain, seems to become overwrought. Uh, One of the reasons it can feel a bit like returning to puberty. Sleep disruption may in part be to do with the brainstem's regulation of automatic processes like breathing and sleep, but of course there are other elements like changing melatonin production, changing diurnal rhythm of cortisol, potentially low magnesium if the digestive system is not doing so well, which can happen. Inflammation. There's many reasons why sleep may be disrupted, but includes the brainstem. And indeed, the hypothalamus pituitary adrenal axis, the stress trigger axis, which may account for anxiety, as indeed all those areas of the limbic system that are reacting to safety and a sense of safety and fear. There is a decrease in the volume of gray and white matter. We have, or she has, mostly Mosconi and some others have noticed that the drip feed of glucose that the brain needs doesn't seem to be as readily applied. And then we can also see that there is changes in blood glucose regulation in people in perimenopause, which may affect the glucose feed to the brain, but it may also be a separate thing that is not related to blood glucose dysregulation. ATP is basically a sort of, it's like the cells make the money they need to pay other cells to function. So it's a substance made by cells that is required for cellular function. And that has been seen to be less either effective or plentiful in peri and post menopause. I'm sure many of you, if you are in peri or post menopause, will have struggled with memory. But what has been seen in MRIs is that they are measurably the same, measurably equal to what you can see on an MRI as a brain energy change. So you can see that someone who has poorer memory, there is less energy in the brain, very direct correlation. And then we have impacts to neurotransmitters, which are talked about in the Anatomy of the Brain and Neurons lecture, which are the excitatory or the calming neurotransmitters or feel-good hormones, things like GABA again and serotonin, for example, serotonin as a calming neurotransmitter, GABA as a calming neurotransmitter as well. And then what's interesting is that so estrogen receptors are on lots of cells throughout the body, and they're the reason why perimenopause is so widely affecting. And they're like a little, I'll just stop the share here for a minute so I can be a bit clearer in case you can't see me. So estrogen receptors, you'd imagine a little flag on a cell that's waiting for estrogen to dock on. And the idea is it's a very specifically estrogen-shaped flag or a receptor. And the estrogen, as it's passing, docks on and gives the cell a signal as to what its job is. So let's say, for example, you have estrogen receptors in the interior walls of your arteries on cells that are designed to keep the interior walls of your arteries supple by whatever means that is. I don't know what that means is. But if it doesn't have estrogen to dock on, the cell is left wondering what its job is. And so its function of keeping those arterial walls supple is not being carried out because the cell is just going, oh, I don't know my job. And what's been seen in the brain is that we have lots of estrogen receptors in the brain for sure. But in peri and postmenopause, there is a window where there is what's called a higher expression of estrogen receptors. That means sort of higher number of estrogen receptors in the brain in peri and postmenopause. Not forever, but it indicates the possibility that the brain is putting out more estrogen receptors to take advantage of whatever estrogen or estrogen is available. It could also be that it's feeling so little that it's desperately trying to look for someone it doesn't help. But the theory is that it's actually an adaptive process whereby the brain manages to catch whatever estrogen is there. But what's interesting as well is, as well as it being adaptive, is that it in tests for the number or the plentiful nature of estrogen receptors in the brain, it directly and 100% accurately correlates the menopausal status. So you can judge the menopausal status by the number of estrogen receptors in the brain. That may be a little bit nerdy, but I think it's fascinating. And I think what's really important to point out here is that the brain shows in many regions adaptation to what is essentially quite a struggle that it faces in peri and postmenopause. As my brain fog is with me, I'm just going to double check my notes and see if there's anything that I wanted to tell you. I'll just read a direct quote from here from Lisa Mosconi. Menopause transition changes the brain's structure, energy consumption, and connectivity. The volume of the brain's gray matter, which consists of nerve cells, decreases, as does white matter, which contain the fibers that connect the nerve cells. Brain regions associated with memory and perception also show declining glucose levels. And the good news is that women's brains at least partly compensate for those decreased issues with blood flow and production of a molecule called ATP, which, as I said, is the energy source for cells. Her study suggests that the brain has the ability to find a new normal after menopause in most. So, next slide. This is just a quick slide of estrogen receptor density or proliferation or activation. And you can see how it increases with the brain looking for more estrogen, presumably. As we age, so there are lots of concerns about the whole body as we age. And I think the most important thing to remember is that we do all age and we cannot stop everything. Stuff will happen, and every part of our body is doing what the external body looks to be doing. And there is a limited amount that we can do. But the wonderful thing is that there are things that we can do. And before I go into this in more detail, I want you to remember, and remember this for your clients too, that though Alzheimer's dementia is now statistically the most frightening disease of later life that people report that they're most afraid of contracting, though it is really frightening, it is one of the most preventable diseases by lifestyle. I will say that again. Alzheimer's dementia is one of the most preventable diseases by lifestyle. And you can even have the gene or the double gene for Alzheimer's dementia and not develop symptoms. We will go into that a bit more at a later point, but just before we even mention it, I want to help you understand that. I also want to point out that what happens in menopause is not something that is isolated and only happens to people who experience menopause. It can also happen to people of the male gender, i.e., they can, of course, contract Alzheimer's, but also there is a decrease in the volume of grey and white matter. Excuse me, there is a decrease in ATP efficiency and amount. There will be decreasing blood flow. There is also, sadly, heightened HPA axis, the stress response, which is another one of the reasons why I'm so interested in working with older people, is that the idea of being kind of spooked for the rest of our lives does not appeal to me. And anything we can do to support the HPA axis, I will jump on for ourselves and for the people that we care for. Amyloid plaques are kind of like in the brain, the equivalent of furring of the arteries, and they do seem to affect more people with female sex hormones than with male sex hormones, where I need to be binary here, where 2/3 of the people with Alzheimer's dementia are female. That's the research we have is very binary in terms of gender. Mini strokes and blood vessel damage will often happen in later life, and many people will get over these little mini strokes really quite well. Atrophy is again the shrinkage and because of non-use of the brain. And there are a number of types of dementias. Alzheimer's is by far the most common. Vascular dementia is usually because of a stroke or some kind of vascular, meaning blood related event in the brain, stroke, hemorrhage, etc. And that's where cardiovascular health is so important for the prevention of vascular dementia. Oh yeah, so that's written on the right there that cardiovascular issues are contributing to both types of dementia, but obviously on a very sort of basic level to vascular dementia. And blood glucose dysregulation has been seen to be a contributing factor both for cardiovascular issues and for Alzheimer's dementia. So that is blood sugar dysregulation, if that term is confusing to you, which can lead to something called insulin resistance, which is the precursor for type 2 diabetes. But you don't have to even get to type 2 diabetes for blood glucose dysregulation to be problematic for the brain. So looking after blood glucose is a huge, big deal. And there is some details on that in the nutrition video further on in the resources. Poor breathing, obviously that would be an issue regarding oxygenation to the brain. And I should have had in there actually, and I don't, poor sleep, because there is a detoxification that happens during sleep of the brain. And it needs to happen during sleep because that's when the brain shrinks every night and to allow that cleansing to happen. Low nourishment can happen, of course, from undereating, but also from malabsorption, which The more elderly we get is really quite common to be not absorbing vitamins and minerals as well as we might. So again, looking into the nutrition video, and there's a list at the end of the manual around nutrition, thinking of things like magnesium and omega-3s and vitamin D, lots of macro and micronutrients that are important for the brain. Stress, of course, a big factor, can increase inflammation, which is also a risk factor for brain issues. Exercise has been seen as just the bomb in terms of protection of the brain. And certainly the older people get, they tend to become less interested in moving. But also if there is injury or illness, then that is going to prevent or make movement a little less attractive or possible. So that's why in Yoga for Menopause, for example, and Yoga for Bone Health, I'm really, really keen to really protect people from injury during asana, because injury in later life is not the same as injury in younger life, because injury will take longer to repair the older we get. And the longer the repair is going on, the less likely the person is to be moving. So then when movement ceases, it's much quicker for atrophy to happen, muscular atrophy, and the ill health or the health implications of not moving in our 50s, 60s, 70s, 80s is much more serious than not moving in our 20s and 30s, when we will be able to eventually repair all those tissues and get back to where we were. Social exclusion is a really big issue of our time, and there are certainly cultures who have less social exclusion and more social exclusion of people in their later years, but it is an absolute predictor of health and longevity is the level of social inclusion or exclusion. And lack of activation, of course, lack of learning new things and trying, learning new things, really challenging the brain. The solution. Oh, no, there isn't a magic solution for stopping the brain aging or stopping all of us aging, but we will do our best. So I love this woman. Our general supports, I've mentioned them in the last slide, but just wanting to bring them, some of them in the last slide, wanting to bring them into one slide. This is a nice, easy one for you to take a photograph of and pin it to your fridge, give it to your family. A fairly achievable list when you look at it to a degree. I mean, of course, there's some stuff that doesn't feel achievable, but nervous system regulation, seeing there how much it supports. It not only supports just not feeling freaked out and anxious, but also supports cardiovascular health, reduces inflammation, supports which you may not be aware of, blood glucose regulation. So the nervous system hyperactivity can destabilize blood glucose, and when we are at ease in the nervous system, that is supported. Can also help with breathing. I'm sure you're very aware of shallow breathing when you're stressed and the ability to breathe more deeply when you're feeling regulated, but also not just physiologically do you breathe deeper when you are in parasympathetic, but also you feel safer and able to perform pranayama, for example, whereas if you're in sympathetic or in a trauma response, then deep breathing can be really triggering and not so possible. And nervous system regulation really affects our digestion. So nutrient absorption will be supported by regulating the nervous system. Cardiovascular health in itself, outside of nervous system regulation, is supported by exercise, particularly exercise that increases heart rate, but also exercise that compresses or rather contracts muscle. So strength training will positively impact cardiovascular health, or some of the strength additions that are in the videos that you are expected to watch, the sequences on isometric and dynamic um, additions to a yoga class or practice. Excuse me. Managing blood pressure is very important. Some people find that if they're on hormone therapy or menopause hormone therapy, that can help to regulate blood pressure because progesterone helps is a diuretic, and without it, it can be a contributing factor to high blood pressure. In the strength videos, the one on isometrics, you'll hear me say that high blood pressure or blood pressure regulation is best supported by isometric contraction. There's lots of other supports for high blood pressure, but that isometric contraction of the muscles seems to be the most supportive of blood pressure regulating of the different kinds of contraction, eccentric, concentric, isometric. So their plank and your anything that is involving strength without movement of the limbs, without shortening and lengthening muscles. Looking after cholesterol, a lot of people post-menopause have high cholesterol, as do a lot of people who are cis male, but it's a really important, thing to look after, and it can be done. I think there's a piece on that in the nutrition section, but it's primarily making sure, of course, to be careful about high saturated fatty foods, but also really looking after your bowel movements, and having loads and loads of fiber is really supportive for cholesterol. And stress, of course, management and regulation, which is a big part of this training. Exercise in general, this is outside of the cardiovascular health piece, but exercise in general can support our memory and our ability to learn. It can help regulate blood glucose, improves brain blood flow, and brain-derived neurotrophic factor, which is a really important compound for the functioning of the brain. Social inclusion, I've already mentioned. Learning new things, I've mentioned. Plentiful and varied nutrition. So there's a lot of dieting still going on, even in, times of our lives when we thought we'd be past dieting. Calorie restriction, calorie deficit often is at the expense of nutrition. So being extremely careful about making sure that you have a huge variety of particularly plant foods for your micronutrients, and plenty of complex carbohydrates, which help to stabilize blood glucose, and plenty of protein, which the brain needs too. Smoking and alcohol are real baddies for our brain and our heart, particularly for Alzheimer's dementia. That's a really important risk factor. And spiritual fitness, which is something I will go into more in the training later. But then one that not many people know about is hearing loss. I myself have hearing impairment to a great degree, and have hearing aids. And one of the reasons I got hearing aids is that hearing loss that is not treated is associated with a considerably higher risk of Alzheimer's dementia. And those who then use hearing aids, which is the only treatment in inverted commas for hearing loss, can then reduce that risk back again. So very important to, as much as there is a stigma connected with hearing loss, I certainly feel it myself, that it is important to get and use hearing aids. They are also really uncomfortable in many ways, not physically so much as they make everything very loud. So please forgive any family members that you have who are resistant to using their hearing aids, because they are quite jangling, but gently try and persuade them to, with as little fear as possible, helping them understand that it may protect their brain in the future. So in our training here, more than just what we've already talked about for keeping the brain healthy, we're adding much wider tools for nervous system regulation. You haven't met them all yet. We will over the weeks, but eye exercises, you will discover why they're so valuable to the nervous system, and very much achievable, and something that people can do for a minute, for 2 minutes, a few times a day in their car, at a traffic light, not while they're driving, of course, on the toilet, on a break from work, even at their desk. So they're very usable in a wide range of circumstances. You'll be learning that not only are we trying to deactivate and downregulate the nervous system, but there are ways that we can upregulate it, which, just like the heart needs stimulation to increase heartbeat in order to keep it healthy, the brain and nervous system both respond to positive stress. So we'll be talking a little bit in more detail about activating and deactivating pranayama and breath practices. And we'll be talking about the brain's sense of safety and how to improve that, and how we can tell whether the brain is feeling safe or not, because that is a big contributor to our nervous system regulation. Then there is a whole other section which is about stressing the brain deliberately, exercising the brain via neurostimulus. We'll be learning how to put memory and cognition challenges into class. You'll be taught and also asked to find some non-dominant challenges, and I'll be teaching you some coordination challenges, which you can choose to learn or find some others yourself. I'll be encouraging you to bring variety into your teaching. So people who maybe do Ashtanga or Bikram, where there is a very set sequence of yoga poses, you might find it difficult to vary your teaching, but it's not just about where do I put each posture in class. It's about maybe bringing some stuff that doesn't feel quite like yoga asana into your classes, something that just surprises them each week, even though there's going to be familiarity for a sense of safety, sense of progression. We're trying to bring in something a little bit new each week, or it might be week one, you bring them something new and then help them build expertise over a course of 5 weeks or 6 weeks or whatever. But variety really counts. And if you do struggle with the idea of bringing in things that are not traditional yoga, please remember that asana was not created in a day. And indeed, much of it came from Swedish gymnastics, bodybuilding, all sorts of different European physical practices that were brought back to India about 100 years ago by a particular yogi. So there is no reason why we can't use new things, use what we know now to enhance the neurological and maybe physiological as well benefits of our teaching. If you're interested in that, because of course, if you just want to teach yoga for the sake of yoga, that's absolutely fine too. And there are benefits for the brain from yoga anyway, but just not necessarily this neurostimulus. Vestibular training, which you will learn is a bit more than just balance training, has been seen to improve cognitive function. So we will be working on that. And then I'll be adding somatics, which I just find is a practice that really helps support that brain-body connection in a way that sometimes yoga asana doesn't. Sometimes I think yoga asana can be done in a quite disconnected way, brain to body, but we need to bring the brain and body into the practice. Sometimes I think in yoga we stay just in the body and we forget about the value of the brain. But also, I definitely see practitioners who just don't seem quite as connected to the body as they might actually believe themselves to be because they're making interesting shapes. And then as well, this idea of including strength and dynamic movements that increase or support heart rate variability, which is so good for the nervous system and for the cardiovascular system. So those are some of the things that we will be using that are, I think, a little different to a normal yoga class to support cognitive function and brain health through the decades. So I hope that that has been clear and interesting, and that you will, of course, send any questions to me. But of course, we'll be addressing a lot of that in greater detail. Really, that's the whole point of certainly much of my contribution to the training, which is primarily about neurostimulus, how to keep the brain ticking over and challenged and fed and positively stressed, and then also how to add some of Diana's work and my work into a yoga class. So see you live very soon, or enjoy the next recording too.